I'm Terry Cooke, and you're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. Welcome back. We're going to talk about things that are happening in Hamilton, and it's a pleasure to welcome to the show a couple of folks who I have known through their work and their leadership in Hamilton for a long, long time. Lynda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton, and Chris McLaughlin from the Bay Area Restoration Council. Good to have you both with us.
Good to be here.
The story of kind of the environmental arc of Hamilton's history is a fascinating one, largely because of our industrial history, but also because of the way in which we lived and where we put our garbage and stuff like that. It really changed the landscape of Hamilton, and over the course of many generations did a whole lot of damage to the natural environment here. But in more recent times, as awareness has grown and contributions by a multiple cross-section of stakeholders has weighed in, we've seen some remarkable and positive changes. And really today what I wanted to have a chance to talk to each of you about is both the work of your organizations, but also the inspiration and the passion that you bring to the work, and where you found that original interest in making a difference to the environment that we live in. So Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot first. Tell us about how you came to do the work that you're doing.
I finished high school at the same time that Brian Mulroney was second time elected, and the Green Plan and the rise of environment and the polls right up there with economy, fittingly, in the late 80s. So went into environmental studies. That seemed to be the way to go and where the future lay for me. And
also demonstrates that you're a whole lot younger than Lynda or I, so don't rub that in.
And then I had the good fortune of stumbling into a master's degree with somebody that's made a real significant impact on me, and then I had a similar experience with a PhD advisor. Years later, I'm just the personality that part-time PhD suits. Wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but it's turned into a real foundation for a career. And I spent several years at McMaster studying Great Lakes water policy from 30,000 feet, and then 6 months later took over at BARC, the Bay Area Restoration Council here in Hamilton, and came right down to ground level and dealing with the issues here. And it's fascinating to study how things like how processes like the remedial action plan in Hamilton to restore the harbor work at an academic level, and then
in reality,
be in the meetings with a mandate myself. It's been really fascinating, and in an important way. I think I'm not only well suited to the work that I do, but it's an important underpinning for all of the work that gets done out in the world by activists and volunteers and others. So I feel good. I feel comfortable in my role in that way too.
Same question to you. How'd you come to do this work?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a lifelong Hamiltonian. I'm from a family of proud steel workers.
Stelco or DeFasco?
DeFasco.
As a kid who grew up at number 2 Rod Mill at Stelco, I'm on the other side of the fence.
Okay, yeah. Spent a summer working in the mill as a university student.
As did I.
Did you really?
Yep.
Yeah. So that was quite an experience. And I think for me it was always living this life of contrasts, right? Like seeing the kinds of impacts we were having on environment in Hamilton, and as a part of the family, going away to enjoy natural areas somewhere else. And that even from the time I was a kid, that always struck me as an odd thing. And why aren't we paying more attention to what's happening in our own city? And I think all the way along that was always an interest I had. So I did a science degree at McMaster, biochemistry, and had a chance to go down the road of doing some environmental biochemistry. So back when Dr. Brian McCary, terrific guy, was still around, worked with him and another researcher, and did a lot of analysis of Hagersville tire fire smoke. And
gosh, do I remember that?
Do you remember that one? Yeah, and started to realize, that was a scary incident. And how does policy work, and how do all these pieces connect? And
in fact, we were talking about Bob Ray before we went on air. I remember meeting with Bob Ray at City Hall. He was the opposition leader at the time as the Hagersville tire fire was happening, talking about what were the implications for municipalities. But I digress.
Yeah. So interesting. It made me realize I don't want to be a scientist. I want to be out there fiddling with how everything is connected to everything else. So I ended up doing a Master's of Environmental Studies out on the East Coast, Dalhousie University. Got into community-based environmental monitoring, which now really permeates the work that we do at Environment Hamilton. came back to Hamilton, worked for a while on marsh restoration and harbor-related work. Ended up back in a PhD that I never dreamed I would do that, but still, you know, was focused on radical forms of planning, and I studied community environmental activism in the Red Hill watershed.
No kidding.
So when the Red Hill battle was happening,
I don't remember that. What happened then?
Yes, yes. Well, let me tell you, Terry.
We have to do another entire show on that
We do,
one.
yeah, we do. But that had a huge impact on me, and realizing, you know, that there are all these elements at play there, and coming out of that, I think, well, I know there were a number of us who decided we need another organization in this community, one that can do public education and outreach on the environment, but one that can also, you know, kind of push the envelope and make some noise when we need to make some noise.
And public policy matters at the
Absolutely,
end of the day, right?
absolutely.
And all of the great, I always say, all of the great volunteer work, all the great philanthropy in the world will never compensate for bad public policy. So we always have to have public policy and activism on our collective agendas, or we're not going to move the yardsticks, right?
Look at the choices around environmental policy we're going to have in the upcoming provincial election.
Yeah.
Like, they're pretty stark.
Indeed.
They are.
I want to bring it back, though, to the work that each of you are doing. And one of my questions is always, let's start with the good news. You've had a recent report about water quality in the harbor. And, of course, most famously, Sheila Kopp's donned a wetsuit to go into Hamilton Harbour when she was throwing down the gauntlet about water quality. And we all know some of the horror stories about our harbor having been one of the hot spots in the Great Lakes. But tell us most recently what's happened there and some of the good news before we talk about what are the remaining challenges.
Right. Well, I suppose there are some examples. People might have heard recently about the walleye being restored, a top native predator in the harbor being restored. And so this is literally, back in 2012, a truckload of 50,000 fingerlings, little tiny guys like that, and they are jettisoned out off of Bayfront Park. And some of them are doing remarkably well. We got a picture of one in the Spectator a couple weeks ago at 28 inches. A winter fishery has emerged out of nowhere. And so, I mean, it's little signs like that recovery is possible. I think that gives people hope, and I think that's one of the most remarkable aspects of the RAP, and probably the thing that we need to hang our hat on the most is that there's hope that we can continue to make improvements. And you have to have that after 30 years.
Right. And the story of the RAP, which we can't tell in full, is that in fact it took the efforts of a whole range of players to in fact bring about the things that we've seen in terms of positive improvements. And it wasn't just governments, although governments obviously played a role.
Right. When the Remedial Action Plan program started in the 1980s, they had no idea how they were going to engage community and move beyond the government and industry that had been around the table making decisions about policy up until that point. So it's really a remarkable story here in Hamilton that we're renowned across the Great Lakes for the community involvement here and a number of the aspects of the RAP that have been missing in other places. And when you grow up in a place or you live in a place long enough, you know, you forget about all the really remarkable things about a place, right? And so,
and this is also a place in my experience that is hard on itself. Right,
it's very hard on itself.
It doesn't like to acknowledge progress, and as much as we like to moan and complain about all the things that still need to be done and the things we may be unhappy about, it's important to celebrate success and identify things that collectively we've been able to do together. Same question to you, unrelated to water quality. Tell us what the good news is environmentally. What have we been able to collectively achieve that Environmental Hamilton has been a part of?
Yeah, I would say I'm noticing a real difference in, I think we've always been an engaged community, but I think it's become more inclusive engagement. Is that a good way to describe it? So when I look at the work that we do as Environment Hamilton, and we're right down at the neighborhood level, and we're interacting with lots of people where they're being impacted in various ways. And what I've seen, and I would actually point to things like the Neighborhood Action Strategy, that have helped because it's facilitated empowerment. People are really feeling like they can make a difference. So when we go into neighborhoods with programming now, whether we're talking to people about air quality or friendly streets or planting more trees in some of the partnership work we do with other organizations, we're encountering people now who are saying, right on, how do I get involved and how can I play a role? And it's been a combination of things. I think it's been that mobilization of neighborhoods, but there's also been a neat dynamic that I've noticed as new people come into the city.
So do I.
Right?
Yeah.
So you neighborhoods close to industry where in the past you'd talk to residents who'd say, wow, come on, Lynda, what can I expect?
That's right.
Look at where I live.
Yep.
Those people are now waking up a little bit more because their neighbor who's just moved in from another community is saying, hey, why are you putting up with this impact
Right.
or that impact? You know, where I came from, we didn't have these kinds of problems. It can be better. So I would say that's the really good news story. And
Tell us about the Friendly Streets Initiative. First of all, I love the description and
yes.
the title.
Yeah, I love the name too. So this is a project that we launched as a pilot over 2017 in partnership with Cycle Hamilton. Again, you know, another new organization that's emerged on the scene. And it was really focused on drilling down to the neighborhood level in and around the Hamilton General Hospital and talking to pedestrians and cyclists about how could things be better. So it was a lot of walking along the street with people. Our staff member Beatrice Cooke working with Elise Desjardins from Cycle Hamilton. Yeah. They made a point of trying to engage every stakeholder they could think of, everyone from hospital workers to seniors to local businesses and other residents. Really getting that dialogue going about how could we make the street feel better, whether it's a safety issue, whether it's getting around on your bike, whether it's better public transit service. And they built this fantastic toolkit that we're now hoping to be able to continue to refine and ultimately take to other neighborhoods across urban Hamilton.
Gotta love that.
Yeah, great response too. I mean, I think that was the most exciting thing about that project, and I think it had a lot to do with the name, because when you say that to people, everyone feels like they have something to contribute with a title like that.
As opposed to something that divides folks into, you know, this is the war on the car versus I'm a cyclist. We need to think about how we engage people at the place that they're in. And observation based on that community engagement comment, I always think that I'm really fortunate to not be in political office now, because the level of sophistication and involvement by neighborhoods and by citizens is so dramatically different than it was 15 or 20 years ago, and I think in an entirely positive way for the community. You won't believe it, but we're at the intermission point because we're halfway out of time. But Lynda Lukasik and Chris McLaughlin, you're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. We're talking about the environmental arc of Hamilton's history and the work being done by the Bay Area Restoration Council and by Environmental Hamilton. We will be right back after this commercial break.
Bring them on. The ones who aren't sure. The ones who can't wait. The ones with brand new shoes. And the ones with shoelace issues. The ones who love to be part of a group. And the ones who stand silent, tall, and more or less ready. At the YMCA, we believe potential is every kid's right. Every kid's advantage. Every kid's secret weapon. And the thing about potential is you don't want it to just stay potential. You want it to become everything it can be. At the Y, we never met a kid whose potential we couldn't see.
And we're back. You're watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. I'm Terry Cooke. I'm with Chris McLaughlin and Lynda Lukasik. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that remain, because in the front half of the program we talked about really some of the progress that's been made on the environment in Hamilton, but we've still got a lot of work to do. And Lynda, your organization recently received a grant from the Toronto Atmospheric Fund to work specifically on public transit, an area very much in the news in Hamilton for a whole bunch of reasons, not necessarily good, and an area near and dear to my heart because my grandpa ran the Hamilton Street Railway for the better part of 50 years, and I grew up around the bus company. So talk to us about the work you're doing there and about more broadly, so what are the things that we still need to do in this community to continue the momentum that we've seen?
So we're really excited. We got some support for a couple of years to do some work in Hamilton focused on transit. So we'd already been doing a little bit of work as part of our climate action campaign around, we have the moniker Fix the HSR, just to get more people engaged and asking questions about transit and pushing for improvements. So this support from the Atmospheric Fund is to really delve into both working on organizing riders, so the idea of bringing transit riders together and helping them to find their voice, call their counselors, tell them they want to see improvements. And then there's another piece that involves reaching out and pulling together a diversity of organizational stakeholders so that it's not just us, because this really isn't just an environmental or climate change issue. It's about working towards preparing ourselves as a community for the future, for LRT or higher order transit. It's about what I'd like to call mobility justice. We live in a community where there are a lot of people who struggle with that basic ability to move around. And ultimately, I'd say it's about moving towards post-carbon society. How are we preparing ourselves as Hamilton for that future? And our argument is that if we're not making that investment now, we're kind of playing some catch-up as it is, we're never going to get to where we need to be. So there need to be those community voices really calling out for and supporting that shift in the right direction.
And I always ask, and are you feeling more hope or despair?
I always feel hope. I think I'm an eternal optimist. I think you have to be to do this work, and I think there are a lot of other Hamiltonians who feel the same way. I think we all work hard in this community because we see what the potential is. So on the transit front, I'm hopeful because I think more and more it's going to become just more obvious that this is what we need to be doing. We still, Hamilton, I think it's fair to say we're a community that is dominated by car culture to a large degree, but at the same time I'm seeing, and I'd argue it's partly with generational changes, we're seeing shifts in more sustainable directions. So I'm optimistic for that reason.
I always find the LRT debate instructive on that front.
Yes.
In that, as a longtime proponent of higher order transit, almost without exception, when I talk to people my age or older, they're skeptical or outright opposed. And when I talk to my kids, I talk to people in their 20s or 30s, when I talk to people who have moved here from other large cities that are used to a higher level of transit capacity, they are almost universally urgently in favor of getting on with the kind of changes that are contemplated. And again, it's not just LRT, it's the broader network of transit infrastructure that we need to build if we're going to meet the challenges of the future. But that generational divide is very, very stark, and obviously that's something we need to work on. Chris, in the area of the challenges that remain, your organization recently issued a report card on the state of the harbor and gave it a C+. So obviously, much as the walleye are a good news story, that there are a whole lot of things that remain to be done, and part of the remedial work of dealing with the legacy of both sanitary sewer discharge and industrial contaminants. So talk to us about that. Why is it a C+? What do we need to do to make it a B or an A?
Right. Well, I think the first observation to make is that C+ is not a failing grade, and we would have been failing miserably for a long, long time. So I always like to point out, that we have seen a lot of successes for 30 years of work. A lot of the problems that remain are literally underwater, and so you get, the law of diminishing returns, where people can get down to access the water now. We went from 3 to 30% of the perimeter of the bay being accessible to the public.
In what time frame?
Over the last 25 years, since the beginning of the Remedial Action Plan in the early 90s. So a lot of that's from trails and open spaces, from the RBG to Windermere Basin, places you can get down and become close to nature, close to the water, but not necessarily go right in the water. And you mentioned Sheila Copps earlier about her foray into at the beach there back in the 80s.
I'm going to say late 80s, right? That's my recollection.
Late 80s, and had the misfortune of wearing a wetsuit that didn't help. She went in at a place that's typically still among the only places where you're going to find bacteria in sufficient amounts to make the water dangerous, and that's right at our artificial beaches. Just offshore 50 yards, you find great water a lot of the time, most of the time. We still have the issue of algal blooms, which are system-wide, but we don't find sewage, all the way from the South Shore, Hamilton Harbour, over to LaSalle Park that we would have like a century ago. Just a uniformly dangerous place. And we haven't shaken the perception of that yet. And so the hope comes from the fact that with every day, new people get down, new people come to town, like we talked about. And they love the fact that this place has these amazing natural assets, the marshes, the rivers, and trails and places that you can go and access them, right? The forecasts, too, for the grades are up. So we expect in another 5 years, when we do this exercise again, that we'll see improvements. That's the expectation. So,
but I mean, to harken back, I remember when we made the massive investments in the stormwater holding facilities that dealt with kind of the easier parts of large discharges of the harbor. It strikes me that the fixes that remain are not as simple. So
not at all, actually.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that.
We've cut phosphorus, for example, that drives those algal blooms that makes the harbor dangerous in the summertime. We cut them in half, and we cut them in half again. And we have this little bit left to go, but that's coming off the watershed, off our driveways and parking lots and farm fields. So it doesn't just involve government and we can leave it up to scientists and bureaucrats to take care of it. It's now more and more up to all of us, which comes back to why it's so important that we have enhanced engagement, right, in communities, across neighborhoods, that people can see the connection between what they do on their property and the surface water and ultimately down to the bay, you know, that they're having an impact, that they are connected. Yeah. And we still have a relationship with water where we turn on the tap and we flush the toilet, and that is in large part the extent of it, right? So we really need to impress upon people that we're all connected in a social ecosystem too.
Perfect setup to my closing question. And actually, before I do that, I just wanted to say, your discussion of what's happened in the harbor reminds me so much of so many conversations I had with my grandfather, because he was a great local historian and used to, as we would either walk around or drive around town, point out all of the places that had been filled in either by sanitary landfill, like the Hill Street yard right across the street that is now a dog park from where we sit, to all of the inlets that ran as far south as King Street in some cases, right? Scott Park was the end of an inlet, and most of Burlington Street was a causeway when it was really originally created, and that both changed the shape of the community, but it also created a lasting environmental legacy that we're still dealing with. So the final question is, so what can each of us do to help to kind of close the gap between where we're at and where we need to meet the challenges of the future?
So I'm going to focus on the need for all of us to think about how we move around. And I say that right now because when I think about the climate crisis, in Hamilton we know transportation is our major source. Without counting, we've got industry, which is a huge source, but in terms of community contributions, that's a big one. And then I'd argue on the air quality side too, transportation's one of our bigger problems as well, with fine particulate contributions and those sorts of things. So I think all of us as individuals, if we can make more sustainable choices, that's a huge way to make a difference in pushing Hamilton in a more healthy direction. And it loops right back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of transit and enhanced transit. And if there are demands for that kind of service as opposed to driving around in your car, that's ultimately going to help with that whole network as well. Get on your bike, walk,
and
get on the bus.
There's a piece of that citizens can affect that isn't always as obvious to them, which is when we think about how we plan communities and neighborhoods and streets, it's being vocal advocates for a balanced and friendly approach, because we all have a different perspective of how neighborhoods or cities work when you drive a car versus when you're walking or cycling with your kids, right? And we need to inform the planning process and the conversations we have as neighbors and neighborhoods with institutions in a way that makes them think about the needs of all of us and not just the folks who are driving down a 5-lane highway on Main Street at rush hour. Same question to you.
I'm going to say
something profound would be good at this
profound.
Stage. No pressure.
Well, I'm going to say engage in the world around you, in our community, and become that advocate. It's a really powerful thing when I can share some of these great stories about either the past or hope for the future, and then turn people loose to talk about it with their neighbors over the back fence. It's far more powerful than and we reach obviously a lot more people. So a lot of people, you know, only so many people can come out and volunteer for Environment Hamilton or for BARC. For sure, do that. Take the opportunity to get out. Plant some cattails with us in the marsh. It's a very...
Write a check.
Or
write your fundraiser.
Write a check. Come to our fundraisers. Also highly recommended.
Leave a gift in their will.
Fantastic idea. But become an advocate, and we find, especially with this community's historical relationship with the water here in the Bay, perception's not keeping up with reality. Reality is still a C+ by and large,
Yeah.
But there's so many great stories to tell, and we've known for a long time that a sense of place is really critical to changing those perceptions and changing behavior and developing that sense of pride. And this is not having grown up here and coming here in my late 20s. It's a strange thing growing up in the Kawarthas that you just, every 10 feet there's water to jump in.
Yeah.
And being here is such a strange thing that so many people spend decades of their life right here growing up in town and they've never been in the water. That's such a strange thing, and so we need to change that perspective and develop a better sense of pride in the community, and I think that would go a long way to attaching then to the quality of life aspect, that it's not just about, clean air and water, it's about the quality of our lives.
A
right?
perfect point of departure, and unfortunately we are out of time. Lynda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton, Chris McLaughlin from Bay Area Restoration Council, let me thank you, first of all, for being with us today. Secondly, for the work that you are both doing in this community, and Lynda, for the work that you have done over literally a generation, because it makes a difference, and as Hamiltonians, we're better for your collective efforts. I'm Terry Cooke. You've been watching Hamilton's Vital Signs. As always, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We hope you'll join us again next month. We're done. Over and out. See you next month.